I want to open your Bibles up to Luke chapter 24. We're going to be looking at an account tonight that I'll readily admit to you is a bit peculiar. There's some odd things in this story after the resurrection. And we'll touch on those just a little bit, but the real focus that I want you and I to have is lessons that we can learn today off of this story. This is an account on the road to Emmaus, about a 7-mile walk, I think I read it was, from Jerusalem up to this little village of Emmaus. And they're walking, and this is after the death, the burial, and the resurrection, which these two people apparently, I'm not going to say they don't know about, but they're not so sure about. They've heard about it. They've been told that Jesus is not in the grave, but they're not quite so sure what to make of all of it. And this is the account, this is the story where two people are walking on this road with Jesus, and yet they don't know they're with Jesus. And the reason that we're going to be looking at this, and the application I'm going to try to make for me and you tonight is this. Most of the folks who are here, you're walking with Jesus as well. You made a decision and a commitment at some point in your life. Every one of us, it might be a different time in our lives. But we made a decision and a commitment that I'm going to be a follower of Jesus. We made a confession somewhere at some time before some group of people. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I believe that He is the creator of heaven and earth. I believe He has all authority over heaven and earth. I believe that He was born of a virgin, that He died for my sins, and that after 3 days He was raised from the dead, never to die again, and that now He sits at the right hand of the Father, ruling over His kingdom. And we made a confession somewhere along the lines of something like that. And based upon that confession, which is nothing more than an acknowledgement of what we have accepted to believe as true, we make a decision then that we're going to follow Jesus into the grave and then back out of the grave. And through baptism, we're born again. And now we're on the road with Jesus. But if we will be completely honest, we would admit that there are times on our walk with Jesus when He's not so easy to see. There are places and situations, there are seasons in my life it's not so easy to see Jesus. Maybe I know He's there deep down in my heart, but I'm not really seeing the evidence of His presence at the time. Or maybe I'm choosing not to see it. Or maybe I'm blinded to it by other things. Or maybe I'm distracted from it by other things. Now, when I say see Jesus, I wish I could say otherwise, but I have to be honest, I have never with my own eyes seen Jesus like Saul of Tarsus did on the road to Damascus. When the Lord appeared to him there and He asked him, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I've never seen Jesus like that. Not with my eyes, visibly, tangibly, like I'm seeing all of you. But by faith, as we sing the song, by faith I can see. And by faith I've seen Jesus many, many times in many places. In fact, there have been times in my life that the knowledge of the presence of Jesus is the only thing that got me through those moments. But at other times, I didn't see Jesus. Just like these two folks here in Luke 24 don't see Jesus, even though He's literally right beside them and they're talking and walking with Him the whole way. They still don't see Him. So we're going to look at some ideas tonight about maybe why we don't see Jesus sometimes. Because you might be in a place or a time in your life right now where you're looking around, you're going, okay, Lord, it'd be really nice for You to show up about now because I'm not so sure how this is going to pan out. I could really use some help. I'm not going to tell you why you don't see Jesus. I'm just going to suggest some reasons why we don't see Jesus. And maybe something rings a bell with you and can be of a little help to you. We're in Luke chapter 24. We're going to pick up in verse number 13 where the story begins. That very day, speaking of the day that Jesus rose and that the apostles had visited the tomb and Mary Magdalene had visited the tomb, that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus. Now, if you're wondering who the them are, we're going to be told in a minute names, but the them is just a reference to disciples. These aren't unbelievers. These aren't strangers. These aren't, Pharisees who were partly involved in his execution or Roman soldiers who helped carry it out. These are disciples. These are people who follow Jesus. That very day, 2 of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, I'm going to pause long enough to tell you something about that word discussing. It's a real gentle word. It could just mean a conversation, and that may be what it's about. It could be where they're like asking questions. Well, what do you think happened? Well, what do you think happened? Why do you think he didn't come back? Or why do you think he did? It may be something along those lines. It could be. But this same word is also sometimes used, and it's translated as disputing or conflict. And it's an argument is what we would think of. Now, I'll tell you, I'm not a scholar, and even the scholars I've read, they don't all agree on it. I don't know if they're arguing or not, but I know they could be. Because this word can refer to 2 people who are having an argument. And that may help us understand a little bit more why they don't see him here in a few minutes. They're walking and they're talking with each other about all these things that had happened. Verse 15, while they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. Verse 16 says, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. You got to pause again right here for a minute. When we read this phrase, their eyes were kept from recognizing him. I don't know if it means that the Lord was doing something that prevented them from being able to see him. Could mean that. There are some commentators and scholars who say that's what this means. Or it could mean that the Lord is in some different type of form. Not that he's not in bodily form, but that he looks different in some way. He is, after all, in his glorified body. He is in his resurrected body. And Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that that resurrected body is different than the body we inhabit now, although it's the same body. Now, I don't know what that means. I just know that that's what Paul says. It's the same body that went into the grave, but there's something different about it. Now, what that is, I don't know. The Scriptures don't really tell us. Here's what the Scriptures do tell us. Mary Magdalene encountered the resurrected Jesus there near the tomb, and you know what? She didn't recognize him either. She thought he was the gardener. Later on in John chapter 21, the disciples are going to be out on the boat fishing, and Jesus is going to be on the shore, and they're not going to recognize him either. So I don't know if it's something about the resurrected body of Jesus that he looks different in some way. I don't know. Some scholars and commentators will tell you that's why they don't recognize him. Of course, others will tell you it's because the Lord was preventing them from being able to see. And still others will tell you this. It doesn't have to mean anything like that. It just means for one reason or another, they don't recognize who he is. And you say, well, how in the world could you not know that this was Jesus? Keep in mind, not every disciple of Jesus was like Peter, James, and John. Not every one of them reclined as John did at the Last Supper with his head on Jesus' chest. Not every one of them stood face to face within arm's length. And the way John describes it in 1 John 1, saw with our eyes, heard with our ears, touched with our hands, have handled of the word of life. Not everybody had experienced that. Not every disciple knew Jesus intimately. You think about in the days when he's traveling on foot and in these villages and speaking to these large crowds, oftentimes of thousands of people. Maybe they don't get very close to him at all. There were times when not even his own brothers and sisters and mother could get close to him because of the crowd. So I would anticipate that it was common for a lot of the disciples to have never actually been up close and personal with Jesus. And by the way, what about Jesus would stand out? Now, when you watch him on TV or in the movies or paintings, it's easy to pick him out, right? There's usually a halo about his head or a glow about him or something like that. But when you read the description of the Scripture, it's the exact opposite. There was nothing about him that caused him to stand out. In fact, Isaiah, speaking about the Messiah in prophecy, said that there was no comeliness in him. In other words, he wasn't an especially good-looking man that people, when they saw him coming, go, wow, look at this guy. Now, they did that with Saul, the first king, you remember. Saul was tall, dark, and handsome. He looked the part. Jesus didn't look the part. And apparently, even when people found out who he was, sometimes they still scratched their heads and said, this guy? Did anything good that come out of Nazareth? This guy, the guy who's Joseph's son, the carpenter? This is the Messiah? This is the one? So I don't know which of these it is, and anybody who tells you they do, they're lying to you. because nobody knows for sure. It could be any of those three things. Here's what we do know. They can't tell it's Jesus. They don't see Jesus. This happens to us. When we lived in Tennessee, Jade will tell this story all the time. She said, I never would go to Walmart with Brandon. I never would go. And there's two reasons why. Number one, born and raised in Pulaski. I'm kin to about half of Pulaski. And then I was a preacher on TV and radio in Pulaski for 15 years. So guess what? I knew a lot of people. And you go to Walmart, which, by the way, in Pulaski, Walmart is the mall. That's our mall. There's not much in Pulaski. So you go to Walmart, sometimes just to walk around because there's nothing else to do. It's dark. They roll the sidewalks up. So you go to Walmart. And so, when we would go to Walmart, usually I would see 1,000 people I knew, and we'd stop and talk and have conversations. So Jade said, I ain't got time. I got to get groceries. You stay here and talk. I'm going to go get our stuff, and then I'll come and meet you up here at the checkout when it's time. But I learned a trick. I could put on blue jeans, a T-shirt, and a baseball cap. And I couldn't have been in any better disguise than if I was dressed up like a woman. I could walk right up to people and speak to them, and they wouldn't even recognize it was me for a second or two. You've probably done the same thing. Have you ever seen someone that you know very well, but you see them in a setting where you're not accustomed to seeing them? Maybe you work with them, and you run into them one day out at the river. And they're dressed different, and they're acting different, and they're in a place where you're not used to seeing them, and you can look right at them and you don't even recognize them. I'm not going to tell who, but I ran into somebody here at the gym one time, and I had no idea. They were literally looking at me and waving. And I was thinking, why is this good-looking girl waving at me? Man, this treadmill time's paying off, I guess. And then I realized who it was. It's like, oh, well, never mind. Ego got deflated real quick, Anyway, sometimes we can see people that we know, but we don't recognize them. I don't know which of the three it is, but I know they don't know him. And so the story continues, if you'll pick up with me in verse number 17. And Jesus said to them, what is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk? And they stood still, notice this, looking sad. Man, you ever ask one of those questions and as soon as you ask it, you regret it? Somebody, you walk up to them and you can tell maybe there's something on their mind. You say, what you thinking about? And then you see tears well up and you go, oh no, what have I touched on? I was just being polite. I was just being friendly, but I've struck a nerve here. Jesus said, what are y'all talking about? And they stood still, looking sad. And one of them, named Cleopas, answered him. And this is kind of comic relief in the midst of the story. Are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened in these last few days? What are we talking about? What is anybody talking about? There's one headline on the Jerusalem Times. Jesus of Nazareth is dead. Now, if you're reading the Roman paper, Jewish troublemaker executed. Jewish terrorist plot thwarted. Look, it doesn't matter on what side of the fence you're on. Everybody knows what's been happening in Jerusalem the last few days, apparently except this one guy. And they go, what are we talking about? There's only one conversation going on right now. Verse 19, he said to them, what things? And they said to him concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. Pay attention to this. But we had hoped. What's that imply to you? They didn't say, but we hope. It's past tense, isn't it? The implication being they don't hope anymore. But we had hoped. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and beside all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see. And he said to them, O foolish ones, slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He acted as if he were going further, but they urged him strongly, saying, Stay with us, for it is toward evening and the day is now far spent. So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. See, I told you it's an unusual story. Verse 32, they said to each other, Did our hearts not burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? And they rose the same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, The Lord has indeed risen and has appeared to Simon. Then they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. As they were talking about these things, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, Peace to you. We'll stop right there because we want to get into why did they not recognize Jesus. You remember I mentioned there at the beginning of the story in verses 14 and 15, when Jesus comes up, they're having a conversation. And I don't know if they're just discussing it, debating it, or they're arguing because the text is ambiguous. But we, for the sake of our purpose tonight, are going to make an assumption here. We're going to assume that they're arguing with each other. One of them has one opinion, the other has another opinion. Each of them thinks they're right, and they're both arguing with each other when Jesus walks up. Maybe one of them is arguing and saying, you know what, there's no way he could have been the Messiah. We know that one of them said, we had hoped that he was the one who would redeem Israel. So we know one of them is at least assuming Jesus is not who he claimed to be. Maybe the other person was arguing, now wait a minute, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. I want to assume something. Whether or not it's true with them, it's definitely true with us. Sometimes the reason I can't see Jesus is because of conflict that is in my life. Because I'm not at peace with other people. Now you say, well, what kind of conflict do you mean? Any kind. Those of you who are married, have you ever noticed how it impacts every other area of your life if there's conflict in the marriage? Food that you love to eat doesn't taste good. Things that you enjoy doing, whether it's golf or fishing or shopping or cross-stitching or skiing or duck hunting or whatever it is. When there's conflict between the two of you, you can't enjoy the things that you enjoy. You can't even go to work and get your mind off of it because you find yourself while you're at work thinking about the conflict that's existing back home that you're going to go back home to at 3 o'clock or 5 o'clock or whenever you get off. The point being, when there is conflict in our lives, it drains not only our attention but also our energy. The energy that we have that normally we would dedicate and devote to other things, the attention that we would have that normally we would put on other things. And here's the reason why. Because typically speaking, when I'm in conflict with someone, it's very easy for it to become no longer about what is right, but about being right. It doesn't matter if it's your kids or your spouse or your boss or your next door neighbor or your preacher or your elders or whoever it is. When conflict arises, if we do not handle it properly, it quickly turns into a war of me against you, us against them, and then it's all about being right. I've got to prove that I'm right. Have you ever seen fights that go on way, way longer than they have to? Way, way longer than after it's been proven what is right or who is right, simply because somebody is not going to back down, because to back down would be to admit that I was wrong. Pride begins to get in the way. Selfishness begins to creep in. Now, I don't know if that's what's happening here, but I do know this. Times when it's hard for me to see Jesus is when there's conflict in my life. And you say, well, conflict with who? Conflict with anybody. With anybody. Have you not noticed how, and some people are good at this, and so this wouldn't apply to you. And if that doesn't, like I said, I'm not up here to tell you this is your problem. I'm up here to point out some problems, and you can say, is this something that maybe is causing me to not be able to see Jesus right now? A lot of times, things that should not bother us so much become the center of our world. Somebody made a comment about something on Facebook. Now, everything else in your life is good and well and right, but you just can't get over that. They disagreed with me. They disagreed with me publicly on my page. And so liked it. So they obviously agree with them and disagree with me. And before we know it, we find ourselves obsessing. Look, I've seen it. I've seen these threads that go on and on and on, back and forth like a ping pong match. It's conflict. Here's what Scripture says about conflict. If you argue with your brother in the way, settle things with your brother while you're in the way. Deal with it. Deal with conflict when it arises. The caution that we get later on in Ephesians is don't let the sun go down upon your wrath. Don't put it off. Don't let it, because here's what happens to conflict that goes unresolved. It tends to grow. It's like yeast. It just begins to leaven and it begins to fill and it just begins to expand. And then you find that your conflict with this person now starts spilling over onto other people as well. Have you ever had somebody in your life say, hey, look, whoa, hey buddy, back it down. I didn't do anything to you. You're not mad at me, you're mad at them, but you're taking it out on me. You ever heard those words before? So that's what conflict does when it's unresolved. It grows. It spreads. Sometimes then other people do begin to get involved. And what starts off with a conflict with this person is now a conflict with their spouse and their kids and their parents and the people they live and go to school with and go to work with. And it grows and grows and grows. And then you wind up with these. Have you ever stopped to ask this question? Why do countries hate each other? Has any other country ever done anything to our country? You say, well, yeah, history's filled with it. No. You're basing that on the actions of a few people, right? But you see, those few people represent everybody else, right? And that's where we wind up saying that all of them are like that. Well, let me tell you what, if we were on the other side of the ocean, guess what they're saying? All of you are like that too. So that's what happens with conflict. That's why the Scripture says, deal with it. Don't let it grow. Don't let it expand. Because if conflict is present, it's hard to see Jesus. It's hard to see Jesus. Now, if you look at verses 18 through 20, you see something else. And this is one that's tougher. Conflict can be solved most times as simple as going to somebody and going, you know what? This really got out of hand. And I'm really sorry to see that it's turned into this. I want to apologize. And you say, well, wait a minute, I don't have anything to apologize for. They did it. Let me ask you a question. Do you want the conflict to be settled? If you want the conflict to be settled, sometimes you have to apologize for things that maybe you don't genuinely believe that you did, but what you're doing is you're trying to extend an olive branch. And sometimes if I'll extend the olive branch first, then the other person will reciprocate. And they'll say, you know what, you're right. I lost my cool, and I said something I shouldn't. Ultimately, see, you can do something about conflict. This one's a little trickier. When Jesus said, what is it that's been going on that you were talking about? Verses 18 through 20 says that they were sad. And then they started talking about the death of Jesus. Grief. One of the hardest times it is to see, one of the times it can be the hardest to see Jesus is when we're grieving. Because when we're grieving, the only thing we can see is the pain, the loss, the suffering, the sadness. It consumes us. I've always said it's one of the strangest ironies. Whenever there is a death, the first thing that we do culturally is we bring food. And when there is a death, the first thing that we do instinctively is we don't care about things like food anymore. Because we're dealing with grief. And when we're grieving, we shut down. And things that mattered. You know what? People get up in the morning excited about going to see a new Spider-Man movie tonight. And then death comes. And the last thing on anybody's mind is a cotton-picking movie. I don't care about that anymore. I don't care if I ever see that movie. All I want is what's been taken from me to be given back to me. And in that grief, sometimes it's hard to see Jesus. That's why it's important that in times when we're not in grief, that we fill our hearts with faith. We stockpile, so to speak. You ever watch any of these shows about what they call them preppers? Doomsday preppers, and they build bunkers loaded up with guns and loaded up with food and water and all. So if there's some kind of catastrophic collapse of civilization, I can go underground and I've got food and water and all that. But I'm just going to be honest with you. If civilization collapses, I don't want to survive it. Okay, that don't sound like a lot of fun to me. I'll be honest with you. If everybody I know and love and everything I care about is gone, I don't really want to be walking around out in the desert with a gas mask on, drinking mashed potatoes through a straw or something like that. That doesn't appeal to me. So you can have my store of that. Okay. But here's the thing. When we are in good times, that's when we do stockpile our heart. That's when we do the preparation for the hard times. And in the good times, we've got to hear those words. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? You are with me. You are with me. In the counseling sessions, a lot of times, and my kids have heard this more times than they probably don't ever want to hear it again. But we talk about two things. We talk about facts versus feelings. Facts are true. They're true regardless of what you see, what you hear, what you think. These are facts. They're not up for interpretation. They're not negotiable. They're facts. Feelings, on the other hand, all bets are off. Feelings are unpredictable, they're erratic, they're strange, they're somewhat uncontrollable. We can't necessarily control what we feel. Now, it doesn't mean we can't control what we do with our emotions. That doesn't mean, okay, I feel hurt, so I'm just going to tell you that you're terrible and be mean to you. That's a different thing. That's an action. That's different. But feeling, what you feel, you feel. If you feel scared, you feel scared. Every parent in this room has had a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old come running in their room in the middle of the night, scared absolutely out of their minds because of thunder or because of a boogeyman or because of a spider or because of something. And every parent in here has said to that child, don't be scared. Now that works every time, right? I don't think I've seen it work yet, because that's not how feelings work. You can't tell a feeling what to do and then it obeys. That's why it's important to know facts and feelings and make sure you understand the difference between the two. Because here's a fact. Sometimes the people that you love and that love you are going to do things that hurt you, that make you feel unappreciated or unloved or unwanted or not heard or whatever it is. That's going to happen sometimes. Not because they don't love you, but because they're humans and we do that to each other sometimes in our frailty. I might make you feel unappreciated, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate you. Because perhaps for the past 3 weeks before that, I have both said and shown in multiple ways how much I appreciated you. But in this moment, in this instance, in this way, I made you feel unappreciated. And you genuinely feel that. And when you feel that, what's going to get you through that temporary and fleeting feeling is the fact of knowing, yeah, He does appreciate me. How are you going to get through grief when it's all you can see? How are you going to know Jesus is still there when it's all you can see? Nobody can say, oh, you just need to get over it. Don't you love it when people say that? Oh boy, the things I've heard said at funeral homes. Well-meaning people. Let me tell you a good rule of thumb. If you don't know what to say, don't say anything. Just give a hug. Just smile, hug, walk away. We had an instructor that told this story one time. They had a grandchild born. The grandchild lived, I don't remember, maybe 30 days or something like that. Never left the hospital. Was on machines and things the entire time. And after 30 days or so, the baby died. And at the funeral home, someone said to the mother, you're young, you can still have more children. By the way, that's true. And they did have more children. That don't change the grief, though, does it? You can't just tell yourself, stop being sad. It doesn't work that way. But you can lean on the facts. You can lean on the things that you know. And when you are swamped in grief and you're having trouble seeing Jesus, quit looking for Him, just start listening for Him. You may not be able to see Him, but you can still hear Him. You can still hear Him say, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. You can still hear Him say, he that lives and believes in me will never die, and he that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live again. You can hear Him even if you can't see Him. And here's the thing, it's kind of like a fireman calling people through the smoke. If you hear the voice and follow the voice, eventually you'll be able to see Him again. But grief can sometimes make it hard to see Jesus. If you look at verse number 21, there's something else. Disappointment. And that's what they are. They're disappointed. We had hoped that He was the one to redeem Israel. Man, you talk about a sucker punch. When you get your hopes up and you're expecting something and then it doesn't happen. That disappointment, it's like being on a roller coaster where you're going up, 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 and then suddenly you're just plummeted to the ground and your stomach is up in your throat. Disappointment can really, really do a number on us. Disappointment can make it hard to see Jesus because, sometimes we decide beforehand how Jesus is going to work something out. Here's what we do. We go, okay, I got faith, check. Prayer, check. Obedience to His will, check. So, this sick person I love is going to get well. This job that I want, I'm going to get hired. This bill that I owe, it's going to get paid. Or fill in the blank with whatever it is that you hope. Now, I'm not saying don't do those things. Because we should walk by faith. Faith is a good thing. But there's something else we also have to remember. And that's what the book of Job tells us. We don't know what the Lord knows. And we have to trust Him to work out His will in His way, in His time, not ours. That's what the whole book of Job is about. They assumed they knew how God worked. At the end of the book, God says, you don't know how I work. You're not qualified to know how I work. So why don't you leave that part to me? You do your part. So I'm not saying don't anticipate, don't hope and all that. But in our disappointment, remember, sometimes we don't understand things. And what we think should be how something turns out might be catastrophic. God might be protecting us from things that we never even would see coming. And so we've got to walk with trust even when we can't walk with hope. Verse 24, you get something else. You get the problem of doubt. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb, and they found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. They're skeptical about this. When the women came back and said, we saw Jesus raised from the dead, they didn't go, wonderful, where is he? Let's go get him. Let's go find him. Let's go meet him. Their reaction is, nah, I don't know about that. I want to see for myself. I don't blame them, by the way. I'd have said the same thing. But I want to tell you this. Doubt sometimes is what prevents us from being able to see Jesus. Last one, verses 25 through 27, problem of unbelief. At the end of the day, they just didn't believe. They just didn't believe. And that's why Jesus starts with the Scriptures, and He goes through all of the Old Testament Scriptures and shows them and explains to them all of the things about the Messiah. You see, here's the thing. It's not the case that the Bible was wrong, that Jesus was wrong, or that they were wrong. Everything happened as it was supposed to happen, as He said it would happen, as Scripture pointed out it would happen. Here's where the problem was. They didn't understand what was happening. And it kind of goes back again to that problem we were talking about with Job when God asked him the question, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you? Tell me about that. And he talks about far-off constellations, and he talks about animals, and he talks about the water table, and he asks him a bunch of questions. He says, why don't you explain that to me? And Job's just standing there with his mouth out. He doesn't even begin to understand. And see, that's the problem. They didn't understand what God was doing, and it's no fault of their own. The angels didn't know it either. Because later on in the New Testament, we're going to be told these were things that even the angels were desiring to look into. And the prophets of old, the great prophets, Peter says, they didn't even know because they only had pieces. And so Jesus puts it all together and He explains it to them. And so this is where I want us to end up tonight. Not focusing on the reasons why we can't see Jesus, conflict, grief, disappointment, doubt, unbelief. Did you notice when they saw Jesus? Because that's where it's really important. When did they see Jesus? Verse 30 says they saw Him at the table when He broke the bread. I don't know this to be the case, and I kind of doubt it, but I've heard somebody say this, and I thought it was at least a little interesting. And their suggestion was this. They suggested that Jesus took the bread and He broke it and He blessed it, and then He handed it to them, and when they did, his garment came up and they saw the nail prints in His wrist. And that's when they realized, I don't know if that's the case, maybe it was. I have a tendency to believe it was more akin to they saw Jesus doing something that they had seen Jesus do many times. Feeding people, sitting around a table with people, loving them, praying for them and praying with them. He broke the bread, He blessed the food, and then they went and they gathered with their brethren and they told them what they had seen, and their brethren told them what they had seen. And oh, by the way, guess who just so happened to appear? But Jesus again. And so I learned something from that. If I want to see Jesus and I'm not seeing Him so clearly, there is something I can actually do. Spend time at the table. Spend time in prayer. Spend time with your brothers and sisters in Christ. What we would call worship, that's kind of what's going on here, what we would call worship. When we come together around this table to break this bread, to drink this cup, to remember this death, to celebrate that resurrection, and to pray together, looking forward in anticipation and hope of the day that He returns for us. The day that we will literally see Him with our eyes. No more by faith, but you'll see Him as clearly as you see me standing here right now. Every eye will see Him, John says. And every tongue will confess Him too. But for those, it'll be too late. But for you and me tonight, it's not. We can confess now tonight that we believe that Jesus is the resurrected Christ. So if you find yourself in grief or disappointment, look for Jesus. And if you don't see Him, keep searching for Him until you see Him. And maybe tonight you can see Him clearly. Maybe you see Him and you hear Him and He's saying to you, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Maybe you want that tonight. Can we help you in doing that? Can we baptize you into Jesus Christ tonight and you can begin walking with Jesus? Can we pray for you tonight and pray that God will help you to see Him even in your darkest times? If we can, come while we stand and sing.